Good afternoon, everyone. I'm John Podesta, and on behalf of the Center for American Progress, welcome to today's event. Before we get started, let me do a quick piece of housekeeping to say that live captioning is available by clicking on the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. Now, I'm thrilled to be joined by United States Trade Representative Ambassador Katherine Tai, and I'm going to introduce her in just a moment. Then after her remarks, I'll bring in a fantastic panel for further discussion. But first, I want to kind of set the scene for today's discussion. For as long as there's been trade, there have been adverse environmental effects of trade. But today, the fallout is at unprecedented levels. Increased consumer demand has encouraged illegal fishing practices, emissions, deforestation, and animal trafficking. Over time, these outcomes have had a catastrophic impact on our planet, and it is the communities that benefit the least from trade that are so often the ones who suffer the most from its environmental fallout. In the past 30 years, the U.S. and others have pushed for environmental protection in trade agreements. For example, the United States Mexico-Canada Agreement, the so-called USMCA, provides a recent example. It improved substantially on its predecessor. It incorporated a broad spectrum of environmental standards and monitoring arrangements that includes a critical prohibition on subsidies to fishing fleets that engaged in unsustainable fishing practices. So while meaningful, these steps are clearly not enough. No major trade agreement has adequately accounted for the vast environmental challenges that the global community faces today. This is especially true for climate change, where even a basic acknowledgement of the issue is conspicuously absent in any U.S. free trade agreement, including the USMCA. And to the extent the United States has made progress on environmental protection in its trade agreements, the world is still lagging. WTO agreements lack any binding environmental standards, and in fact, they've actually been used to challenge environmental protections already in place around the world. All of that is, of course, counterproductive. It leads to a global economy that depletes our oceans, strips our forests, and pollutes our airways and waterways. It contributes to more extreme weather conditions, more natural disasters, and more deaths related to climate change all around the globe. And it leaves us all worse off, Americans included. And that's got to change. Deepening economic ties and tackling climate change are not mutually exclusive. In fact, it's the opposite. The benefits of global trade can serve as a powerful incentive for raising environmental standards and creating a sustainable global economy. That could be achieved through a number of mechanisms, such as a carbon border adjustment, clean product procurement standards, environmentally conscious free trade agreements, and tying market access to institutional reforms. You cannot have a thriving global economy if nations are running the world into the ground. Trade policy must be tied to climate and environmental policy, and that's why it's so reassuring to have a federal government that puts these priorities front and center, and to have a United States Trade Representative spearheading this work at the intersection between environmental policy and trade policy. So I want to thank Ambassador Tai for her work, for her past work, for the work she's going to do in the future, and of course for joining us today. Ambassador Tai assumed her role last month after receiving a unanimous vote in the Senate for her confirmation. I joked with her yesterday that I thought that deserved something akin to the Olympic gold medal for the decathlon, getting a 98-0 vote in today's Senate. Prior to that, she was the lead advisor on international trade for the chair of the Ways and Means Committee in the House and the Democratic members. She played an absolutely key role in negotiating better outcomes in the USMCA on behalf of House Democrats. And prior to that, she served as Associate General Counsel and then as Chief Counsel for China Trade Enforcement of the United States Trade Representative's Office. Ambassador Tai, it's wonderful to have you with us. And I'll now hand you the floor for your remarks. But again, thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, John. I'm just checking to see if you can hear me. Wonderful. Thank you for that very kind introduction. You have worked tirelessly to protect the environment and stop climate change throughout your career. Your leadership and the great work of so many brilliant leaders here at the Center for American Progress has fundamentally changed how our country and the world thinks about these issues. We owe you a debt of gratitude, and I know that we can count on your vocal advocacy in the days ahead. It's an honor to join you today and lay out my vision for using trade policy to address one of the biggest challenges that we face. The science indicates that the window of opportunity to prevent a catastrophic environmental chain reaction on our planet is closing fast, and the United States must be a leader in the collective effort to work toward a global solution. From his first days in office, President Biden has taken action to restore American leadership. He and Vice President Harris have made clear that protecting our environment and addressing climate change are core pillars of the administration's Build Back Better agenda. The president immediately rejoined the Paris Agreement and signed a sweeping executive order to begin tackling the climate crisis. The president has made it abundantly clear that we will take a whole of government approach to address this challenge, and that we are going to engage the world from a position of strength. As we do so, we will be mindful of our commitment to environmental justice in addressing climate change, recognizing that this collective challenge requires a collective solution. What we do here at home must be reflected in what we do abroad. Our domestic efforts cannot lead to the exportation of polluting industries to countries with lower standards. The historic investments in the American Rescue Plan are already helping to stabilize the economy and bring the pandemic to an end. The American Jobs Plan is the next step in our effort to reimagine and rebuild a new economy. It will invest in our infrastructure, create good-paying jobs, and position the United States to outcompete any other nation. The president's plan recognizes the critical nexus between these investments and the climate crisis, helping seed the innovation and technological breakthroughs that will make our country the leader in clean energy technology and jobs. These plans are only one part of our strategy. Next week, the president will welcome 40 leaders to a summit on climate to underscore the urgency and economic benefits of taking collective action. The United States will also announce an ambitious 2030 emissions target as our new nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement. President Biden has urged leaders to use the summit as an opportunity to announce even bolder ambitions. Comprehensive action is the only way forward, and this challenge must be at the center of U.S. foreign policy, national security policy, and economic policy. Luckily for us, USTR sits at the intersection of all three areas, and I am honored to lead this agency and the dedicated public servants who will answer the call. During my confirmation hearing, I made clear that protecting our planet would be a top priority. For too long, we believed that trade liberalization would lead to a gradual improvement in environmental protection as countries grew wealthier from increased trade flows. But the reality is that the system itself creates an incentive to compete by maintaining lower standards, or worse yet, by lowering those standards even further. Many companies make sourcing decisions based on these artificially low costs, creating pressure on competing countries to ask if they too should suppress environmental protection to attract investment. This is what people mean when they say the rules of trade promote a race to the bottom. Fortunately, the investing community is demanding more information about companies' climate and other environmental risks. CAP knows this issue well, having hosted acting SEC Chair Allison Herron-Lee just last month as the Commission steps up its work on corporate disclosures around environmental and social governance. Even as investors take a greater interest in companies' environmental risk exposure, the multilateral trading system has no rules to address the corporate incentive to participate in the race to the bottom. Rather, the environmental protection measures of WTO members are exposed to challenge. While countries can avail themselves of what amounts to an affirmative defense, that defense has proven difficult to invoke successfully. This is part of the reason why today the WTO is considered by many as an institution that not only has no solutions to offer on environmental concerns, but is part of the problem. For many decades, efforts to integrate environmental concerns through trade agreements were largely dismissed as wrong-headed, bleeding heart attempts to incorporate social issues in the trading system. According to this line of thinking, environmental issues are either irrelevant or tangentially related to economics or trade. The view that environmental issues are not an inherent part of trade ignores the reality that the existing rules of globalization incentivize downward pressure on environmental protection. This puts countries with higher environmental standards at a competitive disadvantage. That is not a social issue. It is an economic incentive. It doesn't have to be this way. For nearly 15 years, the United States has enjoyed bipartisan support for including basic enforceable labor and environmental rules in bilateral and regional trade agreements. This bipartisan support exists precisely because these issues are economic, not social. The goal is to ensure that we and our trading partners are engaged in fair competition that does not suppress environmental protection. The United States has been and remains the leader in rewriting trade rules so that they move us toward this model of fair competition. USMCA is the most recent example of our own evolution. The updated agreement now includes the most comprehensive environmental standards of any US trade agreement, and I would argue, any trade agreement. Critical environmental provisions reflected in the USMCA include strong rules to address wildlife trafficking, illegal logging and fishing, fisheries subsidies, marine litter, and air and water pollution. I am all too aware that however laudable the rules, they must actually be enforced. Environmental groups have complained for years that chronic lack of enforcement of these rules fundamentally undermines the effort, and they are right. I am committed to enforcing the rules of USMCA and our other agreements to ensure not only that we follow through on our promises to protect the planet, but that we protect our workers against this kind of unfair competition. And while I think the United States, Mexico, and Canada should be proud of USMCA's progress, I know that the agreement does not go nearly far enough in addressing the economic costs of our environmental challenges through trade. The most glaring omission is the failure to explicitly acknowledge climate change. It is clear that going forward, trade has a role to play in discouraging the race to the bottom and incentivizing a race to the top. We must conserve the resources we do have and work with our trading partners to do the same, to both mitigate and adapt to climate pressures. Based on years of experience pushing forward with environmental rules in trade, there are two practical issues that immediately come to mind: putting a stop to illegal logging and addressing overfishing that is destroying the marine ecosystem. We have made some progress on illegal logging and the associated trade in illegally harvested timber products in previous trade agreements and through various regional dialogues. We can do more. The forests are our planet's lungs and therefore important to our economies and the health and well-being of our people. We should use trade policies and trade enforcement actions to protect them. But we have to be mindful that we will only truly address the global scale of this problem through global rules. We have also started to address fisheries and our oceans in our trade agreements, whether through disciplines on the massive subsidies that promote overfishing or through provisions that address the millions of tons of plastic and other forms of pollution that are destroying the marine environment. But again, we will only truly address the global scale of the problem through global rules. This is why the fisheries negotiations at the WTO are so critical. Beyond disciplines that discourage harmful behaviors, we can also create rules that promote positive ones. For climate mitigation, developing innovative environmental technologies, goods, and services, and cultivating strategic international supply chains for their trade will be key. From clean energy to low-emission vehicles and other technologies, reliable access to these goods and services will be essential for our transition to net zero by 2050. That's why I was so committed to helping resolve a big trade dispute between SK Innovation and LG Energy Solutions, two South Korean companies who make electric batteries here in the United States. The settlement, reached last weekend after significant engagement with a range of stakeholders, was a big win for American workers, the environment, and our competitive future. We need a strong, diversified, and resilient supply chain of electric vehicle batteries in America to meet the growing global demand and to expand U.S. manufacturing of clean energy vehicles. This settlement puts the country in a stronger position to drive innovation and growth of clean energy technology. As we consider creating resilient supply chains and strategic trade in environmental goods, we must also be mindful that using clean energy throughout the supply chain is an essential and perhaps underappreciated element of delivering on our commitment to address the full range of practices that compromise the climate. For too long, the traditional trade community has resisted the view that trade policy is a legitimate tool in helping to solve the climate crisis. As we have so often seen with labor issues, there is a certain refuge in arguing that this is all a question of domestic policy and that we need not tackle the daunting task of building international consensus around new rules. But that dated line of thinking only perpetuates the chasm that exists between the lived experiences and expectations of real people on the one hand and trade experts on the other. My job is to bridge that chasm and push for trade reforms that translate into meaningful change in the lives of farmers, ranchers, factory workers, parents, children, not just in the United States, but around the world. Many of these people and many of our businesses realize that tackling climate change and our future prosperity are connected. For example, climate-friendly and sustainable agricultural production is essential to meeting our climate and sustainability goals. Our farmers and ranchers can lead the world with innovative carbon conservation practices. Secretary Vilsack has proposed ambitious ideas, including expanding the use of cover crops and making carbon capture a mainstream conservation practice. I am eager to work with him to help make these practices the new global standard. I am also fortunate to be working with a strong Biden-Harris team of visionary leaders charting this course on climate change. Special Envoy Kerry, Gina McCarthy, the President's National Climate Advisor, EPA Administrator Regan, Energy Secretary Granholm, Commerce Secretary Raimondo, and many more dedicated public servants across the administration are committed to making a difference. CAP research has highlighted many of the ideas these colleagues have brought to national climate policy from innovative state governments, North Carolina, Michigan, Connecticut, and more. But as I close my remarks, I cannot forget arguably the most important voice in this effort, you. From day one, I made it clear that we are not going to do business as usual. I've challenged my team to be thoughtful and innovative in building trusted relationships with stakeholders who haven't had an established seat at the table or been at the table at all. We want a robust dialogue. We expect justice and equity to be on everyone's agenda, and we welcome creative solutions to the massive challenges we face with the environment, with climate change, and trade as a whole. Your voice, your perspectives, your priorities, and your values matter. We need to hear from you. We need to lean on your expertise, and we want your ideas. By engaging new and all too frequently silenced voices and encouraging fresh collaborative thinking, we can forge consensus and find solutions that we never knew existed. Together, we can foster U.S. innovation and the production of new technology while promoting resilient, renewable energy supply chains. This work has the potential to unlock new opportunities for U.S. companies who can help reduce emissions and adapt to climate change. Our bold, collective action can create enormous new economic opportunities and good-paying jobs for all Americans while building the industries of the future. And we will not overlook our obligation to take on centuries of discrimination, oppression, and bigotry. Racial justice and equity must be central to this conversation. The intersection of environment, climate change, labor, and trade are key to our collective ability to compete, innovate, and create livable wage jobs that will provide hope and opportunity for future generations and underserved communities. This is why I believe that trade policy is an essential and strategic part of the solution to these challenges. I look forward to working with all of you in the days ahead to meet this moment. I'm ready, and I hope you are too. Thank you.
Ambassador, thank you so much. And I would note that as at the outset, I said the USMCA didn't include a reference to climate change. I know that wasn't for the lack of pushing by you and by the members you represented. And that's why it's so thrilling to have you in the office rather than your predecessor. And we look forward to working with you, and thank you so much for being with us here today. We look forward to work. All right, now it's my pleasure to turn our attention to our panel. I'm going to make a few brief introductions, and then we're going to get right to questions. And I would note at the outset that we'll be taking questions from the audience. You could submit those questions through the question tab on Zoom or on Twitter using the hashtag #SustainableTrade. But let me go ahead and introduce my panel. Ben Beachy is the director of the Living Economy program at the Sierra Club. He looks to move the economy away from one that benefits corporate polluters and instead towards a more just, equitable, and more sustainable economy. He served as senior policy advisor for the Sierra Club's trade team, research director for Public Citizens Global Trade Watch, and a national organizer for Witness for Peace. Next, Lisa Handy is the director of forest campaigns at the Environmental Investigation Agency, or EIA. In that role, she focuses on forest conservation, wildlife trafficking, climate change, and illegal logging issues. Colette Pichon Battle is the founder and executive director of the Gulf Coast for Law and Policy. She develops programming on, amongst other things, equitable disaster recovery, climate justice, and energy democracy. She has played a critical role in the post-Katrina and post-BP oil disaster recoveries in the Gulf. And finally, Andy Sharpless is the CEO of Oceana and has served in that capacity since 2003. Oceana is the largest international conservation organization fully dedicated to protecting our oceans. So I want to start, guys, with a lightning round. I want to ask you if in a minute or two, if you could put your finger on the one thing, the one idea, the one piece of advice you would give the ambassador to see U.S. trade policy focus that would cause U.S. trade policy to focus on climate crisis, natural resources, conservation, and environmental justice, what would it be? Why don't we start with Lisa?
Thank you very much. I appreciate being here today. And for the lightning round, I think certainly really focusing on enforcement and enforceability of trade provisions that have been negotiated for the environment, as well as moving forward, looking innovatively at negotiating enforceable and implementable provisions there. And if I may, just one other piece, I think certainly through the work that we have done over decades of investigating illicit trade and the way that that operates, I think transparency is absolutely critical here. We can maybe discuss that more after the lightning round, but I think it's going to be really important to all aspects that were highlighted by the ambassador today and that we're looking on to bring positive change in the trade space. Thank you.
Thank you. Ben.
Yeah, so I think one tool I would name to help slow the race to the bottom that Ambassador Tai named is that the US could impose a fee on imports that are made with a high degree of climate pollution, a carbon dumping fee. Corporations may think twice about outsourcing a factory to a country with weaker standards if they know they're going to have to pay this carbon dumping fee to sell their products back in the US. Properly designed, I think this could help reverse the race to the bottom, actually encourage a race to the top, as Ambassador Tai mentioned, serving as a strong incentive for other countries to meet their climate goals in order to ensure duty-free access to the world's largest market, the United States. And beyond the climate benefits this would offer, this fee, carbon tariffs, could also bolster U.S. manufacturing jobs in sectors where we have a competitive advantage like steel, and support the racial equity plank of Build Back Better, since the outsourcing of U.S. manufacturing has disproportionately impacted Black and brown workers in industries like auto parts and electronics.
Thanks. Colette, let me call on you.
Thank you, John. It's such an honor to be here with you, and I really appreciated the ambassador's remarks today. I think I would offer her a pause to really consider for 1 second that there might be something more important than profit. There might be something more important than megatons of things coming in and out of places. And those things that are more important have been lost because sometimes we get into those details and we forget about the people. We forget about the people who are being poisoned, who live next to those ports that are these ships are coming into, that trade is coming into. We forget about the value of this planet and the ecosystems that we all need to survive. And we go towards, how can we make the most profit with the least amount of noise, the least amount of discomfort to profit-making institutions and corporations. I would tell her it is time to put humans and humanity first, even in our trade policy, even in our international conversations. And I hope that she'll take that advice. Thank you.
Thank you. Andy.
I'd want the ambassador to focus on ending subsidized overfishing. Overfishing is a very bad policy to begin with. Paying fleets to overfish is beyond stupid. And if she were going to focus on one aspect of that, cut the subsidies, the fossil fuel subsidies that the overfishing fleets of the world are given by their governments, and do that through enforceable trade deals.
I'm gonna want to come back to that, but let me open things up. Colette, Ben mentioned Build Back Better, and the Vice President's focus, the Justice 40 initiative, is part of that. $2 trillion worth of investment, more than $2 trillion worth of investment. 40% going to disadvantaged communities, and I think the budget and the president and vice president are serious about trying to make good on that. But when those dollars begin to flow, you've had a lot of experience with this, both after Katrina and after Deepwater Horizon. When those dollars begin to flow, how do we make sure that environmental justice leaders, voices, the people you talked about, are at the table deciding how those dollars will be spent?
It's an excellent question. And I think one of the most important. I've seen mass movements around getting policies passed and very good intentions and even wins. But when things have to come down to the state level, you really have to pay attention to the political reality, the little p and the big P political realities of those states. I live in the Gulf South. We are the home of oil and gas. We are the home of deep religious influence, and those folks have the ear of all of the decision makers. It is not in favor of environmental justice communities or communities that are on front line of climate change. I think one way is to really think about that EPA rule around meaningful participation, meaningful engagement. It's not just about having one comment period where folks get 2 minutes to say their piece after having to do their own research around what it is that's coming into their community. It's something much deeper. It's a long-term game. It's something that's rooted in relationships that have to begin now. I think we can use the nonprofit organizations that are on the ground, working on the front lines to actually help our state level agencies that are in charge of distributing dollars. And I think the innovation is going to have to come from outside of the government. Working within these guidelines and these restrictions often lead people to do, a different version of the same old thing. We need a much deeper type of innovation now. And I think we're going to have to engage not just those usual suspects, right? The folks who know a topic, who can talk about a thing, who can represent a community, but the unusual suspects. We need schools, we need arts and culture organizations, we need a broader participation. I think there's a lot of mistrust in what local and federal government can do for the average person. That's a lot of repair. And that repair only comes with good action after good action after good action. We all know it's hard to forgive with just words. The only way to really get down that repair road is to show once and for all that our governments at the federal and state level really care about the folks that put them in office in the first place. I will say we have to make meetings accessible. We can no longer pretend like we're just living in a monolingual, monocultural universe anymore. We are not. We have to make sure that big decisions impacting especially environmental justice communities are accessible by language, by ability, and now even with this COVID consideration, people's ability to access the internet. We have to think about these things or else we'll never get to equity in those decision spaces.
If I could follow up, there was a lot of attention paid to building back better. Maybe the phrase came from post-Katrina, certainly from post-Sandy, and building back with more resilience in mind. Was that I hesitate to use this word, was that a kind of passing effort or is still top of mind for decision makers in your region?
I think the Gulf South missed an opportunity to build back better. And I dare to say New York did too, because while we did rebuild buildings, we did not rebuild a society that was completely decimated. And we could have. We had the opportunity to address not just the physical loss, but what we lost in our community, what we need to build, and what we need to have to be resilient in a new climate reality. I think, for many folks in the Gulf South, especially our decision makers, they are in the deep pockets of oil and gas and other industries that have an interest only in making profits in whatever is left to be extracted from our land and from our people. But no one's really thinking about what building back better could mean, even in the president's plans. I'm grateful that we're dealing with an administration that's at least admitting there's a problem, but this is inadequate to address the climate crisis, and we've got to do better. We cannot have keeping industry happy at the center of our actions. And I think Louisiana has paid the price for that. We're paying the price. More false solutions coming so that industry can be happy. But industry helped to cause and accelerate this problem. It's perhaps time to put our focus on folks who really care about this place that we're on, folks who have lived with this ecology for a long time, folks who have been taught to revere and steward the spaces that we live on. Let's give that a try. Let's prioritize that. I haven't seen that in any of the Build Back from Katrina, from Sandy, from the wildfires. I think we're all still thinking too small and too limited for what's really coming at us.
Ben, that must resonate with you. I think but that focus is on what are we doing here at home, and as I noted, there's not a single trade agreement that mentions climate change, mentions Paris, etc. Is trade really an important tool, or is it kind of a afterthought in the big debate about how we're going to fix the economy, create a just and equitable economy, and is our effort really more focused at home rather than through the trading system?
Trade is part of the equation of climate, jobs, and justice, whether or not we choose for it to be. It doesn't really matter. The arrival of the Build Back Better and the confirmation of Ambassador Tai really creates a new opportunity to build a new trade model in the US that actually supports the climate, jobs, and racial justice and health pillars of President Biden's agenda. The reality is that unless we transform trade, it will actually be a thorn in the side of Build Back Better. Ambassador Tai mentioned that unfair US trade deals have made it easier for corporations to shift their most polluting plants to countries with lower wages, weaker labor and environmental standards, meaning job losses for US workers, disproportionately Black and brown workers, and a dumping of pollution in other countries, disproportionately in Black and brown communities. We then import the steel, the auto parts, and the other goods, which are made abroad with low wages and high pollution, back into the US for our own consumption. And this race to the bottom that has been enabled by unfair trade is clearly a strike against not only climate action, but also good jobs and racial equity. And it's actually contributed to literally half of our industrial climate pollution. We've seen decades of this outsourcing under unfair trade deals. And today, if you add up all the climate pollution that goes into producing the goods that we import in the United States and consume today, it adds up to 1.4 gigatons of climate pollution. No other country in the world imports even half as much embodied climate pollution. And that 1.4 gigatons of imported carbon, it happens to be the same amount of carbon emitted by all US factories combined. So even as we work to reduce emissions from US manufacturing, we will be missing literally half of the industrial climate pollution problem until we address unfair trade. So it is, again, part of the equation whether or not we choose for it to be. We can either just allow it to continue to be part of the equation and allow for the outsourcing of climate pollution and jobs, or we can actually use trade as a tool to help tackle the climate, jobs, and justice crises at the same time.
Lisa, let's flip it over. Ben's talking about outsourcing industrial pollution. What about insourcing the raw materials and the raw products that are being harvested in unsustainable ways? How specifically can trade policy make a difference there?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, John. I think that is the flip side of what's being talked about there and contributes to the problems equally as well is also I wanted to pick up on sort of the marginalizing of voices and communities, because internationally, in country, indigenous and local communities have been shown consistently to be the best stewards of the forest, and they're being increasingly marginalized around the globe as well as threatened outright. And that is impacted by greater deforestation and forest loss. And to come to your point of how can we get at that and what is the US role there, I think one is through greater collaboration to help support and reinforce rules that allow for these communities to have their rights and lands respected as a starting point. And as a piece of that is looking at we talk a lot about free trade agreements here as a central point or trade policy in that way, but also there has been very good strides, I think, in US domestic policy. If we look at just in particularly in reference to deforestation, but also illegal wildlife trade and fishing is implementation of the US Lacey Act, which really gets at where are the goods being sourced from? How are they being sourced? Are they being sourced legally? Are they being processed and imported legally into the US? And I think there's definitely also legislation afoot that should be introduced soon to address commodities that were also sourced from deforestation and forest risk, looking at those same tenets of getting at traceability, transparency, where are things coming from, really taking away the black box, trying to take away the black box of international trade, which is really hiding these inherent costs that underpin the health of the human health, biodiversity, the health of the planet, and are exacerbating climate change at a great rate. So I think that these are all really important things that can be put into our trade agreements, but also done through domestic policy and other trade mechanisms.
How are we doing on transparency, like sourcing transparency, like in terms of both enforcement on the dock side, I guess, as well as knowledge on the consumer side?
I think we have a very long way to go there. I think what we are finding through work that we've been doing is that it is becoming more and more feasible to do really honest traceability and to make that transparent. If you have the right political will and the ability to do that, I think it is essential for supporting all these tenets we're talking about and eventually to sustainable supply chains in the longer term. Because everything we're talking about here, human rights issues, environmental devastation, climate change are all fundamental cornerstones of there being sustainable trade and livelihoods moving forward in the US and around the globe. So we have to get there. And maybe to give one concrete example, in our trade policy, there is a forest annex in the Peru Free Trade Agreement. And as part of that, that has had a positive effect of really keeping close attention. It's shown what can be done through enforcement and work on these issues, but it has also shown the real challenges inherent there. And one piece of that has been a decade or more of working on a traceability system that has really been stymied by those forces that don't want this kind of clarity and light to be shed on what's going on in the trade system. So a lot of progress, a lot of potential, and it's cost effective now, and it really needs the political will to get there. So thank you.
Thank you. Andy, let's turn to the oceans. You talked about the provision that is embodied in the USMCA that begins to cut the subsidies to fishing fleets. In terms of the vast bulk of IUU fishing, that's from distant water industrial fishing fleets, right? Was that a particular problem in the sort of the North American waters context? And how do you tackle that globally? I mean, is a regime like it that is included in the USMCA applicable, to trying to stop IUU fishing off the coast of Africa? Or?
Short answer is yes. So there are two aspects of the USMCA that help with overfishing. One you're calling out, John, here, which is it forbids subsidies for vessels that are listed as IUU, illegal fishing vessels, or associated with that activity. Second is that it just forbids subsidies for the fishing of a species that is overfished. And so you can't, and so in some ways, we have to pay attention to both those elements of the USMCA. If you're worried about illegal fishing off the coast of Africa, as you point out in your question, John, you have to focus a lot on the pressure, for example, that the 12 distant water fleets, so there are about 12 countries that finance distant water fishing on the world by providing subsidies to their fleets to go all over the world and fish. The Chinese are by far the biggest part of that distant water fleet. They have about 3,000 vessels. The European fleet, by comparison, has about 300 distant water fleet vessels. Many of those vessels are up in the EEZs, the exclusive economic zones, off of East Africa, West Africa, I should say, and often associated with illegal activities. And so if you want to stop that, you can forbid it directly by forbidding subsidies for vessels that are identified as IUU vessels, or you can just forbid the subsidy that allows them to get there in the first place. You have to pay these vessels in a lot of cases subsidies for their fuel just to get all the way over to Africa. And if you denied those subsidies, you wouldn't have so much pressure on these poor countries that have trouble supervising and monitoring these distant water fleets.
Well, as the name implies, it's illegal fishing in a lot of cases, right? So can so-called port state measures police a system like you're describing? If there's a ban on subsidies, if we can negotiate a ban on subsidies, how at the port side do you police that question?
Well, yes, you can if you have transparency, as others have already talked about. You need the transparency, you need an enforcement capability in the port side, you need sign on to the port state measures, you need traceability, you need monitoring, satellite monitoring, and you need so forth. and that will work better. I'm a believer in cutting the underlying problem by reducing the number of vessels that are out there to begin with that shouldn't be there, and just drive the fundamental problem out of control. We estimate the world, there are estimates that the fish catching capacity of the world is on the order of 2.5 times what it needs to be if you were trying to build a sustainable global fleet. A lot of that's just bought with subsidized dollars. And if you think about it, that creates a situation where the people in the ports who are trying to do the enforcement, the regulators who are trying to set quotas on what's a sustainable level, face this incredible appetite from too many boats that creates a lot of political pressure for them to do the wrong thing. And so if you wanted to go to the underlying problem, you would reduce the fish catching capacity that is being financed by subsidies. And there you have a very sweet spot for a trade negotiator, because trade negotiators specialize in eliminating subsidies. It's almost easier conversation for trade negotiators to deal with subsidies than it is to deal with the more nuanced conversation about enforcement that you're also appropriately calling to. So we want to do both, but if we could just force out the subsidies that are favoring some fleets over others, A, in the traditional unfair competition way, but B, just creating too much fish catching capacity, too much pressure on the enforcers and the monitors and the regulators, we go a long way.
I'm going to get to questions from the audience here in a second, but we focus a lot on the climate crisis, as we should. There's the interrelated nature crisis, which has multiple causes. But we're losing species rapidly. And there's the upcoming Convention on Biological Diversity that China is hosting. Biden's endorsed 30 by 30 domestically. Think there's any hope for the global movement to protect 30% in lands and oceans, in either in the context of that CBD negotiation or otherwise? Lisa, anybody who a jump ball?
Well, I mean, you bring up a hugely important point, John. It's an imperative that we do that, and I think we talk a lot about the climate crisis right now for very good reason. It needs to be a key focus, but we're also talking about what has just been witnessed here, and we're continuing to live through, is this global pandemic that is been brought about by closer interaction, human-wildlife interaction, led by deforestation and other things, bringing humans into more contact with wildlife. And if you want to look straight in the face of another issue that it has very, very direct and huge economic consequences here and home and around the globe, as well as the devastating health consequences, it needs to be absolutely addressed. So I think looking at how we can make sure we support efforts to curb illegal wildlife trade and protection of lands is absolutely essential in the oceans.
Yeah, just on the ocean side, 90%, more than 90% of the world's wild fish catch comes from within EEZs, exclusive economic zones of coastal countries. So when we go to this 30 by 30 goal, which we should achieve, it's important that we protect a lot of the inshore areas, and we have to watch to make sure that the protections are not only in remote places where actually there aren't so many fish.
Colette, the 30 by 30 movement doesn't just apply to places that are wild, but how do we restore places that have been so substantially degraded by industrialization, by oil and gas development? What's your thought about that?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is to, start from the top of the story, right? And if you trace the Mississippi River and the runoff that comes down that river and the dead zone that then encompasses our state, which was the #1 issue before Katrina, we would get to oil and gas, not because of drilling, but because of pesticides and fertilizers used in big agriculture right on the Mississippi, coming from Iowa, coming down. And so I think, this is it's a bigger issue than we think it is, right? This circle, this cycle that we've created, it comes back to, I was going to say haunt us, but really to kill us. That industrial toxic water comes all the way down the Mississippi. And right now the Mississippi River is quite high. It's quite high because climate change is real and it changes patterns of precipitation. And so now we not only have toxic water in the river, we've got levees that are saturated, and it's just April. We haven't even hit hurricane season yet. And so now we're in a situation. But if we really think about Cancer Alley, that stretch between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, that the residents have now called Death Alley, and I encourage folks to look up Rise St. James and the fight that's happening there, we really get to an understanding of not just how these industries that we are proliferating, giving money to, encouraging to grow, they're killing the people that this society has said over and over again that they care the least about. And if we want to make amends, make repair, start to really get to a level of not just transition, but transformation, we're going to have to look at the principles that we use to decide on who gets sacrificed for profits and who doesn't get sacrificed. I would say the impact of the oil and gas industry on Louisiana, on the Gulf South, has not been terrible the whole time. And I think that's what we've got to, get our head around. There was a time where the story of oil and gas for Louisiana was a prosperous one, but it is now a story about death. It is a story about sea level rise. It is a story about relocation of whole communities and societies. And we've got to understand that there is something more important than the profit that comes from all of these systems that we have in place and all of these agreements that we continue to make. I'll just close by saying, I think the biggest concern for me around these trade agreements and how they impact communities has really been one more around democracy and watching how these trade agreements supersede sometimes even our constitutional protections. And for someone who's looking at how to protect and stand on side of communities to make sure they're protected, understanding that these agreements often override the protections that were there for the people in the first place, I'd say we've got something bigger than just an industrial problem. We've got a democracy problem.
Ben, I know that must resonate with you. We have but I'm trying to pick up some of the questions in the chat, and one of them is you raised the carbon border adjustment or a pollution fee on imported products, which I think Colette's comments kind of open up the question of who's got rights, who doesn't have rights, who gets left behind, how are the secret trade negotiations take place. But specifically, do you think there's an opportunity for the U.S. and the EU to negotiate a common framework? Our systems of reducing pollution are pretty different. I know you've thought a little bit about that, but is there a common approach? If there's a common goal to get to net zero, but there are different approaches to get there, can you sync those systems up? And can you start with the US and the EU?
I think the answer is yes, we can, and yes, we should. I think it's going to be complicated. I think there's several points of alignment that we should try to build transatlantic alignment on, and indeed broader than just the EU and the US as well. For example, are we talking about imposing these carbon dumping fees on literally every good that crosses the border, like the screw that's in your glasses, the toothpaste you used this morning? Or are we talking about like the 5 most energy intensive trade exposed goods, steel, aluminum, cement, et cetera, that make up the lion's share of industrial emissions? What's the basis for calculation? And let me say, like in the United States, I think, say that we're concerned with the border fee that should be placed on 1 ton of steel that the US is importing from China. One method would be to take the emissions that go into that ton of steel in China, minus the emissions that go into that same ton of steel in the United States, and multiply the difference, the precise degree of carbon dumping, by a carbon price at the border. So as to offset the extra emissions. That's not a hypothetical example. Today, more than twice as much carbon goes into the average ton of steel in China versus the US. That's going to be a little bit different than from the way the EU is handling this, but I think through a negotiation, we can at least understand each other's approaches and seek to align them as much as possible. And lastly, I would say it's really going to be important that there be an aligned approach to the WTO. Now is not the time for countries to be dialing down their own climate ambition for fear of a WTO case. now is the time for, if anything, to seek out a peace clause at the WTO, so we don't have more tit for tat cases where countries are challenging each other's climate policies on the basis of outdated trade rules that were written largely, to Colette's point, largely but under the advice and counsel of fossil fuel companies. So I think there needs to be, between the EU and the US, a common approach to the WTO that says, hold up, we need to do a pause and actually allow for the policy space for any country to be able to leverage the tool that trade provides to tackle the climate crisis.
Lisa, I think we think of the EU probably fairly, maybe a little bit unfairly, as being agenda setters in the climate space, most ambitious. Rhodium came out with analysis yesterday that said the EU goal is about the same as Biden's for 2030. Both blocks are headed towards net zero by 2050. But when it comes to sourcing product, is there any difference between the US and the EU and between US-based companies and EU-based companies when it comes to importing products that may have been harvested in an unsustainable manner?
I think both the EU and the US are looking at this issue and problem right now at this time and reevaluating it, particularly in the light of deforestation. I would say that certainly the EU has been talking about climate change and in regard to trade policy and other aspects more than the US has to date. So it's very good to see the US jumping in and catching up there. I think there's a lot to be learned from both sides in addressing illegal trade, and I think building on successes with that both areas have had. And but the EU definitely does have a jump in some areas, certainly in addressing climate impacts for the imports to trade.
Okay. The US is trying to kind of discipline forced labor in Shanxing through trade policy. How is that applicable? Is there an analogy? This is a question from the audience. Is there an analogy on IUU fishing and forced labor on boats that are fishing illegally in waters, Andy?
Yeah, there is, and it would be a really good area for the ambassador to think about and focus on. There are, just specifically on this, there are about 200 vessels that serve as processor vessels at sea that allow fisher vessels to transfer fish at sea to a processor vessel. And the processor vessels that are called refrigerator vessels sometimes stay at sea for years at a time. And they therefore are associated often with forced labor because they facilitate really long fishing expeditions. And so you have a way to focus on and try to track down suspicious vessels. And there's been actually some academic analyses that show illegal fishing often correlates with forced labor activities. One kind of illegality associates with another illegality. So this is a good area for focus where you could hit both problems at once.
I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. We have one from the press. I think this is really to Ben. What are the other most energy and intensive traded goods beyond steel, aluminum, and cement? And what about finished products that utilize a lot of that content, like finished cars, et cetera? How do you adjust in those contexts?
Yeah, great question. So just 5 sectors: cement, iron and steel, aluminum, chemicals and petrochemicals, and pulp and paper. Those 5 account for a large majority of climate pollution from industry worldwide. You can go beyond that list, but those 5 are the 5 biggest. And to the question of what about finished goods? That's a critical design question for the EU, for the US, et cetera. You could get to the lion's share of emissions by focusing on the raw materials. And you could get to an increased degree of emissions, but with an increased degree of work to get to finished goods as well. So where you draw the line on how far down the supply chain to impose the fee is a source of active conversation, I think, on both sides of the Atlantic right now.
Colette, I'm going to ask you the last question, which is President Biden's put a lot of focus on environmental justice. He's brought environmental justice leaders into his administration. He's strengthened the executive order that Carol Brown and I first worked on in the Clinton administration, created some new councils. Would you advise both the interagency council and the outside environmental justice council that is advising CEQ to focus on trade as one of the top priorities for improving environmental justice in the U.S.?
I certainly would. I think for all of the reasons we've heard today from this great panel of speakers, but in places like the Gulf South, where we've got the Port of Houston, the Port of New Orleans, the Gulfport, these are major environmental justice concerns for the communities that live around them, which are majority Black and Brown. I would also say that, you know, and I credit Ben Beachy and his team at Sierra Club, really looking at not just the environmental justice impacts immediately on the community, but the erosion of democracy that these agreements really, I don't think anyone's paying attention to that part, but this democracy question is essential to achieve environmental justice. And it's one that we can't leave out. This is not just about stopping a poison from being near people. This is about process and people's voices being heard and people being part of decisions. And so I definitely think that there's a big play here. And quite frankly, the fossil fuel industry and its role in shipping is huge. And we, you know, the fossil fuel industry, it doesn't just go from the ground into the ship. That stuff has to be refined. It's got to be transferred. It's got to be tracked. That's going into Black communities 80% of the time and poor communities 100% of the time. This is an environmental justice issue. This is a climate justice issue. This is certainly something that I think we haven't been paying enough attention to in the broader climate movement. It would be my deep advice to take a close look at all of these things and as we move forward.
Fantastic. This was a great panel. I want to thank you all. And I would I will close by noting that we're all pretty good at pitching, but it's good to have someone who's willing to catch. And I think with Ambassador Tai and her team, based on her history and her experience, I think sticking together and pushing forward with an environmentally friendly, climate-friendly trade policy I'm more optimistic that we have people who are going to kind of listen to the experts, and we've had plenty of expertise on this panel. So thank you all for joining us, and to our audience, thanks for listening. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, John.
Yeah, thanks for